All right. So, welcome everybody. Today, I am super thrilled to have back for the fifth time Dr. Eric Helms. So, hey Eric, and how much volume should we do in the gym? Just kidding.
Dude, fifth time. This is awesome. I'm so glad to be back on again, man.
Yeah, and in all seriousness, I'm really privileged to have the chance to talk to you for this many times. And you're one of those people, and this might sound a bit creepy, who, even though I never met you in person, Eric, I very much view you as an informal mentor of mine, since your work just had a really big impact on my thinking. And you know, guys, Eric is someone who, even though he gets asked the same questions a lot, he never fails to offer something new and insightful in his responses that can make you think and rethink a lot of things. He's always so calm and thoughtful in his responses, and I'm sure that this podcast will offer some great value to many of you guys. And today, I have a really cool topic that I want to talk about with you, Eric, which is the emotional and psychological cost of macro tracking. But where I want to start is actually not on that topic, but rather one thing that you get asked about quite frequently, which is sort of on the topic of productivity. So, you know, every once in a while I listen to a podcast and I come across some golden nugget that just makes me pause and rethink things. And I heard a quote from you, which I'm actually going to read here verbatim because I thought it was a really strong point. So you said, you have to be incredibly busy to physically not have the hours in the day to get what you need done. What more often happens is that you're so drained that you don't have the energy to utilize the time that you have effectively to get what you need done. So, like I said, I think this was just a really powerful point that you made here. So would you care to elaborate on this point a little bit?
Yeah, man. And before I do that, I want to say we need to rectify that whole we haven't met in person thing. And none of what you said is creepy. I felt honored. So awesome. Thank you. So to address that quote, you know, I was thinking about, while you read it back, I was finding that I agreed with myself, which is good. That means I haven't, totally changed my mind, or I wasn't smoking crack that day on that podcast. But I was reflecting back to when I did my first master's in the States. And that was when I was probably the most physically busy I've ever been, because I was attempting to save enough money to actually get out here to New Zealand to do the rest of my graduate work. And I was a full-time student finishing my master's. I was in the middle of my 2011 contest prep. I was doing extra work to save money, like I mentioned. So I was teaching 30 hours a week at a personal training college. And I was also a full-time 3DMJ coach, and I had, I think, somewhere between 30 and 40 clients, and that many reports per week that I had to respond to. And I was busy to the point where I was using my cardio as my time to study for my master's. So I would choose what cardio I would do in the gym based on what could hold my textbooks, so I could read the chapters I needed to read. Basically, my free time consisted of going to the gym to train, which I did for about 8 hours a week, and then, which I guess is not free time. for competitive bodybuilding, that's not really free time, but that's some of my time was spent doing that, and the rest of my time was spent hanging out with my wife for the most part, and just trying to keep my relationship alive. And we would basically get 2 to 3 hours per night of watching, Netflix and eating dinner. And that was pretty much my only social life. It was also fortunate that she competed in 2011 as well. She was dieting down to a lower weight class for powerlifting. And she also, while she was down there, 'cause she got pretty damn lean, decided to do her probably one and only figure show she'll ever do. So we were able to do cardio together, train together, and then have those probably 2 hours a night where we were watching Netflix, and I was eating a huge salad, and she was also eating some similar diet food. But there was nothing else left. And even then, I was able to have that relaxation time, have that social bonding, and get to the gym also, which I think is pretty important, because I think a lot of people, that's where this comes up in the topic of fitness, is whether or not they have time to get to the gym or have time to do these things. But I had to be very careful, really, to manage my energy. And it was very, very low that whole time. And I didn't have the time anyway. But even then, I had leisure time, I had time to connect, and I had time to get done a lot of different productive things. So I think that gave me a lot of perspective, and getting through my PhD here in New Zealand, I definitely had time to do other things. It was just I was so burnt out, and I think that's really what people mean when they say that they just can't fit anymore, and that's probably a good thing. Obviously, you don't want to go past that point, but I think it's more pertinent to focus on managing your emotions and your energy than it is your specific time in most cases.
Yeah, and I'm always I obviously reading about productivity from actual productivity coaches and authors that are writing about this topic is interesting, but I'm always more intrigued hearing about this from people who are not actually in that niche, but they're just applying these principles for themselves. So I'm curious, obviously you get asked this a lot, how does a typical day in your life look like? But what I actually want to ask instead is what would you say, how many productive hours or in a day, in your opinion, that you can actually use with full efficiency? If you look at your work day, obviously there are a lot of chore things that you need to do. So maybe that's a better way of framing this question. How many working hours are in your day? And out of those, how many are those that are really cognitively demanding and you need to use some of your creative juices and all of those things?
That's a good question. So I think it varies day to day a little bit based on whether I just went through a period of doing deep work, like writing a lot. And it's good timing you're asking me this, because I just finished the second edition of the Muscle and Strength Pyramids. So I just spent a lot of time, digging into research, reading it, getting updated information, thinking about the structure and the information in the first edition, and then changing it and writing fully new chapters in some cases. And I've been doing that since mid-October. So basically, little over 2 months straight of writing, and I would say 4 to 6 hours is what I can put in consistently day to day as far as actually doing productive, deep thinking, critical thinking, writing, and creative work. However, I think there are different types of productivity, and I think what I'm good at is being efficient with my time and knowing what I have the capacity for and what I don't have the capacity for. So, for example, a podcast for me is actually quite easy. I'm an external thinker, or external processor is what some people say, and I kind of figure out things as I speak. Me speaking to you out loud is kind of the same way I think in my head. It comes naturally. I'm extroverted. And of course, when I go on podcasts, I'm always talking about either things I know very well or myself. So they're not difficult questions to answer. And its conversations are pretty easy for me to do. So I think I give this impression that I'm always out there all the time, everywhere, because I just say yes to most podcasts. I'm happy to do an interview, and that's a easy way for me to get good information out there consistently. And I do probably 1 to 2 a week on average. So that takes about, hour and a half of my time, but very little energy. And I can start my day off like I am today at 8 a.m., do an hour and a half long podcast, and then I just go right into my next thing that I'm doing. Another category of work that is not very difficult is just answering emails, which I have a fair amount of from my students, from my clients, and then just from people who have questions, and then also just from things related to the businesses that I'm involved in. And unless they are an actual student question that is pretty in-depth about their master's or PhD, or a client who's doing a report, those are also relatively easy in my wheelhouse, and I can respond to them pretty quickly. So I categorize different work differently, how long it's going to take, how much emotional investment there is. Writing a program, for example, I find is not very emotionally draining, but it is time consuming. And it's kind of just a logical framework and thinking about the needs of the client. I think about all the different things I do and how I would slot them in based on my current energy levels and the time I have available. And I think I'm basically really good at playing time and emotional Tetris with my day. I won't start if I have a new chapter to write for a book that's going to require a ton of creative energy, but I have 3 hours. But let's say I just feel, drained or just not up to it, or just the idea of it just makes me have my gut sink. Like, I'm not going to start that. I'll work on something else. I will do something else. And sometimes if I'm just feeling like trashed in every which way possible, I know, okay, I've pushed it too far in the last week. I'm not going to use this time I have to work. I'm going to do something that is recreational, that is recovering, that is purely just me having fun. And the only times I don't do that is when I'm pressed and have a deadline. And that's when you just have to basically redline it, push yourself past the comfortability point, and then you can deal with the consequences later. But ideally, you don't get to that point in the first place because you manage your time and your energy more efficiently than that.
Yeah, and I'm actually, the figure you mentioned there, like 4 to 6 hours of deep creative type work, that's actually like, for me, it's more like 2 to 4, and 4 is really pushing it. So the fact that for you it's 4 to 6, like it's really impressive, even though it might sound low to somebody who hears, like 10 to 12 hours of, hustling a day or whatever. But I'm actually, like, many times when I'm hearing that, I would want to see how those 10 to 12 hours look like. Like, would you include things like, I don't know, like answering emails into that? And I know, for example, editing a video, for example, can take really long and the time runs out really fast. But yeah, it's awesome that you offered that perspective. And with that, next sort of rapid fire sort of stuff. It doesn't necessarily have to be answered in a rapid fire way, but I just read an article from you not long ago, which was about things that you changed your mind about. And I think this is one of those things that can be the hardest for someone who is a fitness professional, and especially a widely public figure within the community, not just because of ego reasons, of course, that also plays into it, but also because, once people see you as a role model and someone who is an authority figure, like, people start referencing you, like, you probably notice other people using your phrases on different, platforms. So for someone like you to come out and say that, okay, you know what, I was kind of wrong about that, and I think differently now, that must be something pretty challenging. And within this article, I picked out a couple of things, and I just want to quickly run through them as quickly as possible, and as long as necessary, of course. So one of these things is periodization. So would you just quickly outline, like, what you used to say about this and what you think about it now, for hypertrophy, that is?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I used to be a pretty big proponent of using periodization for the goal of hypertrophy, and that I would say I had a bias towards periodization. And I think I'm trying to get to the roots of why I did, and I think it's because for so long I've seen haphazard or redundant or poorly organized training among bodybuilders. And I think instead of just changing that, I looked at where other people in the fitness realm were doing things, quote unquote, right, like powerlifters, Olympic weightlifters, in general, S&C in the more academic sense, strength and conditioning. And they always have very well thought through, sometimes overly thought through training, and things that are well organized, well in advance. So I thought, oh, that's how we should be doing it, instead of just thinking how should we correct some of these problems. So I got very interested in periodization, studied it. Obviously, as a competitive powerlifter, I utilized it, and I trained many of my powerlifters with a periodized model of some type, and then getting involved with Olympic weightlifting for a few years, since like 2011. I've also seen it play out there. So I think it's easy to see when there's an issue somewhere, and then in a closely related field there's a solution, to just jump right to that, instead of maybe thinking a little more creatively and a little more about the specific needs of what is the problem you're seeing and how to correct that with a little more specificity. I think I just went right to, hey, we need to be taking these other concepts and applying them to bodybuilding. And obviously I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and I think it was very effective. But the more research that comes out and the better we understand what hypertrophy is, the less I think that you really need a periodized model, or that it would be even optimal. I think you just need to make sure that there is logical organization, specificity, a way to ensure progression, and training in appropriate rep ranges, and more often making sure those rep ranges line up appropriately with which exercises you're doing, and then basically providing an appropriate overload stimulus and recovery. Now, someone will listen to what I just said and go, that sounds like a periodized plan, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So most periodized plans, you will see a change in the number of sets or the number of reps performed and the manipulation of load and reps and sets in some way over time. So for example, a linear periodized model, you might have sets starting high and then getting lower, or reps starting high and then getting lower while load goes up. It has this linearity to it in terms of volume decreasing over time and intensity going up. That probably doesn't make sense, at least in the long term, for a bodybuilder who maintaining an appropriate level of volume is kind of one of those key variables for hypertrophy. You might have high intensity blocks per se, where you are, pushing lower rep ranges, but the volume as far as the number of sets would probably be a little more similar. You also don't necessarily need like an intensification. You don't really need a block periodized model either, although you can do it. If anything, you might have a daily undulating programming kind of approach where different days have different repetitions, but even then it's not necessary. You might have a spectrum of rep ranges on every day you train. For example, you might be doing 4 to 8 on squats, 8 to 12 on leg press, and then 12 to 15 on a leg curl or something like that, matching the exercise with the different rep ranges. And we have no data to suggest that any like a type periodization is better for hypertrophy. And when you think about it outside of the terms of kind of the way I used to, which is periodization equals good, which is kind of a simplistic way of looking at it. If you think about it, all right, what is required for hypertrophy? We need overload, and then we need progression over time, and then we need to set things up and configure it in a way that allows recovery. And you can achieve that without necessarily having, the tenets of periodization, where you could identify what type it was. You can have all those different rep ranges. You can have progression. I guess you could call the deload part of periodization. So maybe it's this very loosely periodized or has elements of periodization, but you certainly don't need to have a highly structured periodized plan. You just need to manage stress and encourage overload. Right.
And actually, it's funny because I've seen some videos of yours earlier on when you were talking about sort of a linear intensification over a couple of weeks. So, for example, you would do like 3x8 and then 3x6 the next week with a little bit higher load, and then 3x4, and then take a deload, and then repeat the 3x8 with a bit higher weight. What I was thinking about recently is like, is it that periodization model that allowed you to progress in weight, or is it just the fact that you waited 4 weeks to put on 5 pounds on your lifts because now you're advanced and you need to wait for that long?
Yeah, absolutely. A big part of, like when I write about progression in the muscle and strength pyramids, and when I talk about it, a huge portion of that is just matching up the time scale you can expect to progress either load or reps, with over time with the experience level of the person training. So when I set up the novice progression, it's very simple. Next week, when you repeat the same workout, go heavier, or if it's an isolation movement, add reps. And then the one you described is kind of what I typically match up with intermediates. And that progression results in if you take a 4th week deload, it results in every 5th week you're doing the same reps and same number of sets as you did 4 weeks ago with a heavier load. And if you don't need the deload, then it happens every four weeks. So yeah, it's just matching up the time scale more appropriately. And then again, when I set up some of the advanced progression models in the book, we're doing that with a accumulation block of 4 weeks and an intensification block. So it's more like every 6 to 12 weeks you're trying to move the needle in some kind of quantitative way. So I think it's the combination of making sure that the overload is sufficient, and then also understanding that overload might not produce a quantifiable adaptation in the weight room until you've had enough time pass the closer and closer you get to your, quote unquote genetic ceiling.
Yeah, and that kind of dovetails into, although maybe I want to skip some of these because otherwise we will never get to our actual topic, but it kind of dovetails into strength gains and hypertrophy. So you were one of those guys in the industry talking about how you need to get stronger if you want to get bigger. And now kind of the equation, as far as I understand, your stance kind of flipped to, well, probably if you're going to get bigger, then you should probably see yourself getting stronger almost as a benchmark to see whether you've actually gotten bigger. So, yeah.
Yeah, you said that well, Abel. And, it's funny. I made this a very, very short part of that article. Like, I think it's a sentence for what my prior belief was and what my current one is. And in many ways, in practice, if you're smart, and I wasn't always, it doesn't change what you do. So some people might read it and be like, that's a really minor distinction. I don't even really get what he's getting at. But I stated my prior belief as, getting stronger in a variety of movements across a variety of repetition ranges causes hypertrophy. And then my current belief, my updated one, I stated it as increased strength, especially when quantified using a low-skill isolation movement and which persists over longer time periods, indicates hypertrophy has likely occurred. So in the end, in practice, it doesn't change a whole lot in that you're trying to either push heavier loads or add reps with the same loads in the context of a program that hasn't shifted too much. And that's what I did before and how I set things up for my clients. But I think it's easy to make errors when you plateau. If you think that getting stronger is causing hypertrophy rather than it being the indication of hypertrophy occurring over time, then you can do some things like, well, hey, these weightlifters and powerlifters, they seem to be getting stronger more consistently than I do. Maybe I need to be doing, maximum effort days and doing some, explosive speed work or something like that. Like, you might start reading specific program and theory around pure strength and power improvement. And I think then you can get actually further away from the way you're trying to get stronger, right? We know that hypertrophy, muscle size, is one of many components. And I wouldn't even say in an advanced lifter it's the dominant component in all cases for increasing strength. And we know that if we do increase cross-sectional area enough, and we maintain the same rough movements that we have our skill levels with, that should result in us being stronger. That should be contributing to our strength, and we should see that outcome occur in the weight room. So it's a matter of understanding what comes first. And if we understand that hypertrophy comes first and causes strength, that'll prevent us from making those errors, like all of a sudden, training with a lower volume, high intensity approach, seeing ourselves get stronger, but then wondering why we don't necessarily look better or why our measurements haven't increased, etc. Which is something I actually did around 2010, 2011. I got very, very kind of hooked and focused on the powerlifting thing. And I figured, if I'm getting stronger, that means I must be getting bigger. And then as I got more exposed to the research, and I found just how often there is a disassociation between strength and hypertrophy, that only when you keep things relatively constant and you see yourself getting stronger is that indicative, and as a result of hypertrophy, that strength increase is it a useful and reliable metric rather than cause.
Right. Yeah. And damn it. Like this is the downside of not being like a Joe Rogan who can like keep people in here for like 3 hours. Cause like even on this one, we could just go off and talk about this cause it's super interesting. But I actually want to touch on one of the next things, which was about low carb diets. And I guess to slowly transition towards our main topic, I almost want to approach this from a more kind of philosophical perspective, because what I've seen is that it almost became like the politically correct thing in the industry to do, to attack people who follow diets which we could consider fads, like it could be a low carb diet or a keto diet or something. And how do you view this trend yourself? And how do you think someone who is flirting with the idea of jumping into something maybe more extreme than what would be necessary given their goals, how do you think these people should be approached in terms of, what should be our messaging towards these people?
Abel, I really love the way you phrased that, how it became kind of politically correct to do that. And that's not without reason, like in the quote unquote evidence-based community, or just well-meaning fitness professionals who've been around for a while. There's one thing we all know that's true, is that you won't get anywhere without consistent hard work that is sustainable over time. And invariably, there's either one of two things that happens kind of in the mainstream fitness scene. Either you get something that works, but is overly extreme and unsustainable. That people, you see them do it, and you know how it's going to end. As soon as you find out they're going to do it, well, this will last at most 6 weeks, or something that has just false promises, 10-minute abs or some ridiculously low amount of time or small change that is, overly hyped up that's going to make a large outcome difference. So that describes most fads. And it's a good thing for us to kind of try to point out those problems and bring everyone back to, look, there are no shortcuts, and you need to be able to find this as a lifestyle change versus something that you're only coming into because you're not happy with yourself. Like, there's deeper problems here, there's deeper solutions, and there's the whole life change that you need to make if you really want to see your body and your health become better. So I think it's understandable how we get there, but how we do it is also very important. Because I think we need to recognize that most people, and I think this is changing, but it still is probably the dominant number of people, come into nutrition by following some fad diet. And that's probably also true in training. But with nutrition, it's tough because everyone eats. Like, not everyone trains. So to get into the training world, you basically have to figure out, okay, what is someone else doing? And it's more likely that you'll find something that is decent. If you just start lifting weights and you follow people, they might be a little gimmicky and it might be a little unnecessary or too little or too much, somewhere on the hit to Arnold spectrum. But anywhere in there is probably okay to start. But with the nutrition thing, it can be pretty wild, pretty out there, and pretty bad. And you can follow it for a while, and you can even get some results, but it can be at a cost. And I think the reason why it's this kind of politically correct, like, auto assumption of, hey, if you're on a low carb diet, I'm going to, take you down or point out all the flaws with it, or you have already this ammunition already loaded that you're ready to fire away with. Especially, you can see some of the engagements on Facebook from very evidence-based people, but they're discussing things in what I would describe as a very non-evidence-based way. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've seen these debates where there's just as many memes, ad hominems, and just off-the-cuff condescending comments and dismissals as there are actual study links, because everyone's already decided that if you're on a low-carb diet, that means you think calories in, calories out model is false. You believe that insulin causes everything. You think that sugar is the devil, and you think obesity is caused by carbohydrates, and you don't understand that glucose is actually the fuel in the body. And I've seen so many times, people who have legitimate points just kind of get swept under the rug. And it's not that I'm saying low-carb diets are the end-all, be-all, but I think once something gets called out as a fad diet, or especially when there are gurus behind it who are making claims that are false, the assumption then becomes that all things related to it are incorrect, and that becomes the straw man for everyone. So I've seen many people who might have very relevant things to say, using low carb diets in people who are insulin resistant, or using it as a specific treatment to specific clinical concerns, using it in the case of, perhaps elderly people or individuals with PCOS or, neurological problems, or in the management of diabetes, all these things that have very robust lines of research and a rationale for their use for a ketogenic diet or low carb diet, or just personal preference, given that the data normally shows that there is no difference between the two versus one being better for fat loss, and that being then strawmanned as though the person were claiming something like a Lustig or a Gary Taubes might claim. And I think I was a part of that for a while, and I think in the service of trying to inform people about a fad diet, we can't forget that we need to that the ultimate razor that we use to cut through all of that nonsense is logic, but we still have to be compassionate. These are people, because everyone's going to get exposed to fitness and nutrition in typically gimmicky ways, and you don't really convert them by crucifying them or someone they're following, but rather having a discussion with them. And what I like to do is ask them questions about, hey, do you see this as sustainable? Like, what about this does or doesn't work? What conceptions do you currently have about what you can and can't do on this diet? And if there are misconceptions, maybe I can give you a little more freedom, or a little more options, or help you see ways where you can modify this for your life, so that they become more competent with their own nutrition, versus just kind of having a rule or cult-like adherence to something. And I think people dig their heels in a lot more if they're, attacked or if they are made to feel stupid, especially publicly. And that probably keeps more people following something that is harmful than it does convert others. That's just my perspective on it.
Yeah, and I think another thing to keep in mind here is that we are living in a terrible food environment these days where we just have so many cues pushing us to overconsume food, and just not overeating on hyper palatable, calorie dense foods is already some undertaking by itself. And then people who take on a diet strategy, something like, I don't know, a snake diet. I'll just pick something intentionally that's kind of ridiculous. So snake diet, I mean, first of all, how can you even come up with such a stupid name? But, you eat every 3 days and drink salty water in the meantime, and then eat some giant piece of fatty meat, or I don't even know what the protocol is. But the point is that this is something that everybody is making fun of. And yeah, it is for a good reason. But at the same time, if a person is taking this on while being in this hyper obesogenic environment, I mean, I think ahead of all things, we should give this person a lot of props. Like, someone like that just gave a massive testament for his desire to change and make the sacrifices necessary. So instead of jumping on these people and making fun of them, I think, just first let's celebrate the fact that we are in the same team. And then, like you said, in a compassionate way, like you said, just educate them about, more reasonable, enjoyable ways of achieving the same goals thereafter, right?
I totally agree.
Yeah. Cool. So with that, let's get into the actual topic that I wanted to discuss, which is that of macro tracking, calorie tracking, and just being really quantified and measured with your food intake. So I think just as all these fad diets and specialized protocols and whatever are getting bashed in a politically correct or legitimized manner, I think macro tracking kind of became the end-all be-all in the fitness industry with a good reason. I mean, we do know that energy balance matters, and if you want to quantify that, it will obviously help you to get results. But at the same time, I think we developed a tendency where anything else kind of got bashed in maybe an unfair manner. So how have your thinking changed along the lines of macro tracking and calorie tracking for people who are interested in improving their body composition?
Yeah, good question. And I'll spare the history lesson, but I think it's worth saying that so many of these fad diets we're referring to in so many of these systems would not recognize energy balance or just wouldn't address it, and would paint the picture that the solution was to follow some type of diet. And here are the problems with these foods or this food group or this macronutrient or this time of eating. We can think of many, many, many different diets with rules. And most of them, at least that work and that stick around and that do well, at least commercially, they result in someone eating less total food. They find some way to get you to restrict your calories. And I used to look at this as a problem, like, hey, the truth is energy balance, which is the truth. That's how our bodies work. And you can achieve energy balance without these restrictive rules on what food you can eat and when you can eat, just by controlling total calorie intake, which is true. The problem is that is following some diet with rules better in some ways than tracking everything and tracking your calories? Is there harm there? And I don't think I asked that question, say, 4 years ago or more, and I definitely didn't ask it when I first started, as a personal trainer back more than a decade ago. And my first step was often to teach someone about calories, teach someone about macronutrients, and get them to start weighing and tracking their food, and then assessing either body composition or body weight or circumferences or something like that if their goal was fat loss, and then having them adjust their calorie intake in a quantitative manner. And I would say that when I got into research and when I got into coaching bodybuilders, these things were very much reinforced. I'm a quantitative researcher in the realm of nutrition. We figured out what is the appropriate ranges for protein, carbohydrates, fat, rates of weight gain, rates of weight loss. And we have all these metrics, which we have good data to back, which show, the best improvements in body composition. And among bodybuilders who have to, control their calorie intake to get into extremely lean levels, it's even more quantified and with finer degree of precision, because you start to deal with more and more metabolic adaptation. Therefore, you're dealing with smaller and smaller changes that you need to impose to get to the level of energy deficit you need to lose body fat. And I think we looked up one day and we were all tracking macros within 1 to 5 grams of a target, and you'd see things like people posting, what's your nutrition look like? Well, I'm eating 83 grams of fat, 207 grams of carbohydrate, and 212 grams of protein every day, and and not seeing anything wrong with that. Now, what I've come to realize is I've thought about this more deeply and read about it and seen the downsides to this, especially in the bodybuilding world, where people might go years with tracking or tracking on and off, but never having a healthy relationship with food when they're not tracking. It's made me think, there's something wrong here. Like the same reason we have the obesity epidemic, like you were saying, this easy access to hyper palatable foods, having less structured meal times, eating on the go, eating mindlessly. All of a sudden, we have a lot of people who are less healthy and who are much higher in body fat than they would like to be, large in part because they're not in tune with their hunger and their satiety signals. They're no longer eating for physiological reasons. So it's a very different outcome and unhealthy, to be with obesity. But on the other side of it, that's the same thing that happens to bodybuilders. They have to ignore their satiety and hunger signals to get in great shape. And this sometimes results in disordered eating after or even during the competition, where they experience periodic binge eating and what I would describe as subclinical bulimia, where they are restricting calories and then unable to do it, and they overeat in the transition period after their show. When you hear someone say, "Oh, I blew my reverse," that's something that phrase gets thrown around all the time in bodybuilding circles. And what that means is that I was trying to control my calorie intake post-show and slowly build it up without getting, putting on a lot of body fat quickly. And I had a binge blowout day, and then I tried to go back to the reverse. That prompted the next binge blowout day, and this eventually resulted in me in this up and down restrict binge cycle where I actually gained too much body fat too fast, and now I'm disappointed with myself. That's bulimia. Make no mistakes about it. And other parallels are there as well, where you might have a bodybuilder in the off season who's, let's say, a male, and they're at 11 or 12% body fat, but they don't want to put a picture online, or they don't really want to see themselves in the mirror. Despite looking better than 99.9% of everyone, they see themselves in comparison to how they were on stage, and they're not happy. So this is very obvious in the bodybuilding scene. Obviously, we can all look at that and go, that's a problem, and that's not healthy, and that's someone who needs help, and I think some of us can even relate to it. I know I can. But the part of the problem, and not the entire problem, not even close to it, but part of the problem is that we are ignoring satiety, we're ignoring hunger, and we're using these external cues to dictate what we eat. And that means that we get less in tune with the natural signals that our body is sending us. So I think many of the same things that would help someone who is with obesity of getting a better understanding of their body's true needs is something that would definitely help competitors at certain stages. Obviously, you're not going to be able to listen to your hunger and listen to your satiety and get shredded because it'll only be telling you to eat. But once you transition to the off season, and maybe it should be purposeful, we should start paying more and more attention to those internal cues, hunger and satiety, so that we can maybe not exacerbate some of those tendencies towards disordered eating. So that's kind of the preamble to all of it.
Yeah, I think you brought up a couple of really cool points and just topics of discussion here. But first, I'd like to track back for a second on something you mentioned here about how the recommendation to track macros and count calories for everybody has sort of became this default recommendation by many coaches and trainers. And I think personally that this is partially because over time, just an overly optimistic and hyperbolic tone emerged in the marketing around macro tracking and flexible dieting, where people only talking about how awesome it is that you can fit in ice cream and pizza into your macros and how much freedom you get. And often fail to mention what that actually looks like in the real world and just how much precision and extreme moderation that will actually require in real life if you actually want to do that. And, some minor things like if you actually did fit in a lot of ice cream and things like that into your macros in the real world, you would probably be hungry and you would not actually enjoy eating that way. And then, of course, some of the psychological burden of always tracking, which I heard very few people talk about. So I think the messaging is just often very disingenuous here, but I'd love to hear what you think.
Yes, and I think this is actually kind of the second wave, the whole if it fits your macros, because this is older. I remember it being pointed out that that Weight Watchers was one of the only successful quote unquote diet plans, which is basically just works off of the diabetic exchange list and portion control and calorie exchanges. And you would come in, you weigh in, you get community support, and then you would have points. Probably people are familiar with the Weight Watchers point system. That is just a very simplified version of tracking calories and encouraging exercise. You get points back, and then having community support. And it is true that if you look at some of the, I think there's a meta-analysis, I haven't looked at it in a long time, so if I'm misquoting, my apologies, of different systematic weight loss plans or groups or diets. And I think Weight Watchers is typically the most successful. The numbers aren't great, but compared to the others, it's still pretty damn successful. So this has been around for a while. The idea, and like in Weight Watchers, like if you looked at the foods they would sell that were branded Weight Watchers, they'd have brownies and nice foods and these ready-made meals, and they would just be small portion sizes, or sometimes cooked or prepared in ways that had lower sauces, or basically were kind of shoestring budget for calories, but still getting to eat what you want, in kind of the same way that now we see people talking about eating, like you said, cookies and ice cream to fit your macros. So it's not necessarily an entirely new concept that you can basically eat whatever you want so long as you control calories. And I think there's a positive message there, and that most traditional nutrition classes will teach you, is that you shouldn't be restricted. You should have flexibility in your approach if you are trying to lose weight, and it's a matter of portion control. Like portion control is not a new concept. It was around before flexible dieting, or quote unquote flexible dieting, and if you fit your macros. But I think this is just kind of the new age version of it that was kind of influenced by the bodybuilding community, where it's even more tightly controlled than the exchange list and just calories. But now we've got gram amounts of protein, carbs, and fat.
Yeah. Something you mentioned here, which I want to pick up on, about people forgetting to listen to their hunger and satiety signals when tracking macros. And what would you say to people who will come back at this and perhaps say, so what's the harm? Like, yeah, I don't even know how to eat based on hunger and satiety, but so what? It works for me. I mean, I'm lean. I'm fine with following the numbers for the rest of my life. So, I mean, what's the harm, really?
That's a great question. And there is actually that's of course, being the nerd I am, I'm thinking about this and seeing some of these issues pop up among bodybuilders and others. Now I want to go, right, well, so what is the research on this? And there's actually a fair amount. A lot of it's really quite new, which is interesting. So to talk about the specific harm, I think it started with reading an article not too long ago where the relationship between flexible restraint and rigid restraint was called into question. So back in the late 90s, there was a line of research by a guy named Westenhofer, and it's still going on, a really, really good line of research on looking at two different types of restraint. So this is what true flexible dieting comes down to, is that it is a model of flexible restraint. It's not tracking macros. You could be doing flexible dieting with a meal plan with exchanges or Weight Watchers, etc. Tracking macros can be extremely rigid. Flexible restraint is different from rigid restraint in that the understanding is that there is some auto-regulation to it to some degree. There's changes on a day-to-day basis or meal-to-meal basis. There aren't restrictions on foods. There is structure, but there is modifications within it to pay heed to what happened before and what might happen in the future. So it's kind of this structured, flexible planning approach. And people who have a mindset of flexible restraint, the differentiating point between that and rigid restraint is not non-dichotomous thinking, or not thinking in black and white. meaning that they don't see foods as good or bad. They don't think they can only eat at certain times. A lot of the things that are preached in the If It Fits Your Macros community. But they also wouldn't be like, I have to hit 215 grams of carbs every day, and if I blow it, then I might as well eat all the carbs. So that, which can be very similar to a rigid diet plan. So that is the difference, or the proposed difference, between flexible and rigid restraint. However, in 2015 and then again in 2017, there's been some analysis showing that individuals who have high levels of flexible restraint and rigid restraint actually share a lot of variance, statistically speaking, those two paradigms. And they're actually quite similar. And it's only when, in a recent study by Lenardin et al., I think it's Lenardin and Mitchell, Lenardin and Mitchell 2017, did they say, hey, it's only when you exclude the shared variance, which is a lot, I think it's like 50-something% between rigid and flexible restraint, is flexible restraint either neutral or positive. And this is something that we see in the community. Like, it's very easy for someone to be following, If It Fits Your Macros, and come from this community that supposedly preaches, flexibility, but have very, very rigid concepts around food. Like, they won't go out to eat. If they don't control it, they won't do it. They freak out if the nutrition labels for the restaurant aren't listed. Like, oh my God, I thought this restaurant had the macros. I don't know what to do. Like, if that happens, that's not flexible restraint. That's rigid. And I think it's very easy for people to slip in and out of that. So it may be that there isn't harm for an individual. For example, if you understand that, hey, that's okay, I can really estimate the calories here, or I can just order something that is, salad and meat. But if what ends up happening is you go, I don't know what the macros are, I'm freaking out, I'm panicking here, screw it, I'm just going to get a pizza. That might as well be rigid restraint. So whether there's harm is definitely determined on an individual basis. But I think while that's something to consider for the individual dieter, for someone like me who is promoting information and dealing with a large breadth of followers who might follow my advice, or if I'm writing a book, or if I'm working with 30 clients, when I first started thinking about this stuff, I need to think about what is the risk of any given population. And there's a fair amount of research on this that is concerning, let's put it that way. So, for example, there's a study also came out last year by Levinson and colleagues where they interviewed, I think, a couple hundred, it was 100 people. It was like 105 people who were diagnosed with an eating disorder. And 3/4 of them used MyFitnessPal. And of those 3/4, 73% of them perceived using MyFitnessPal and tracking their nutrition as contributing to their eating disorder. Now, I'm not saying it's causative. This is correlational research, right? This is cross-sectional. We don't know causation, and it's very likely that people with an eating disorder are getting MyFitnessPal rather than people without an eating disorder getting MyFitnessPal and then getting an eating disorder because of it. But the fact that a very large percentage of the people who have an eating disorder and use MyFitnessPal feel that it's contributing, or that can be a triggering factor for their eating disorder, I think is something we need to really think about. And then on the other aspect of tracking, there's kind of this, typically, at least in the bodybuilding community, where the goal is to either lose fat or gain muscle. We're trying to see the scale weight change. There's this also the self-weighing that occurs. And there are positives of self-weighing. There's data showing that it results in more maintenance of weight loss and more mindfulness around eating. But there's also negatives. And this line of research is actually much more robust. And we do have causative data that goes all the way back more than 20 years ago. Back in 1997, Ogden and colleagues compared two groups, one that weighed in at the start and the end just twice, pre and post, of a 2-week period, to another group that weighed in every day for a 2-week period. And they saw that the group that weighed in every day had lower levels of happiness and higher levels of neuroticism and stress. And those individuals who either gained weight or didn't lose weight had higher levels of body dissatisfaction. So it became this like emotional barometer, and the day could be dictated by whether or not you lost weight or not. And it just caused a lot of stress for these people. And many competitors and many people who are interested in body recomposition are regularly weighing themselves on MyFitnessPal, tracking their macros. And I think there is potential harm there. I'm not saying there's going to be harm for every single person, but we need to be aware of that and it may not be worth the benefits. So it's basically, we have to ask ourselves, what is the cost of accuracy, precision, and consistency? And then is there a way that we can still achieve our goals while using some of our own natural monitoring and adjustment systems, like paying attention to hunger and satiety, maybe using those as ways of adjusting energy intake, and then looking at the scale less frequently to see if we are gaining at an appropriate rate or what have you. I think there's a middle ground to be had that might be less risky on average.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you finished on this last point because, like you, I have not tracked my macros for a long time. And it's one thing that I made the best progress in my life in the gym and body composition wise ever since I had not tracked. And I know that you have successfully bulked without tracking, and you also did some mini cuts without tracking. And I'd just like to take a few minutes to respond to those people who are now probably going to say that, well, yeah, sure, you can be healthy and happy if you don't track macros, but if you want to have some abs, if you want to make good gains, then it's just not going to happen without tracking macros. So let's talk about this. Like, just how far can you push your body composition and athletic pursuits without tracking macros?
Yeah, great question. I think really it just comes down to so first we have to just acknowledge that a finely tuned, aware person of their own hunger and satiety signals is probably not going to gain weight unless they really just choose a lot of hyperpalatable foods that are low in actual mass or the amount of like space they take up. So your mechanical satiety would be low while you're taking in a lot of calories. That's like the only way, if you actually pay attention to hunger and satiety, is if you only choose very, very calorie dense foods, will you be gaining a lot of weight and being overweight on average, unless you just tend to have a genetic profile that results in carrying a little more body fat than average. But if you have adopted a quote unquote fitness lifestyle to where you're active, you're performing resistance training, and your nutritional habits are largely influenced by consuming like a higher protein, higher fiber, higher fruit and vegetable diet, you can actually take things pretty far. And where the limit is based on at what point can you no longer trust your satiety and hunger signals, or at what point do you need to reach a quantitative goal such that qualitative values might do you a disservice. So for example, if you were a powerlifter and you hover in a natural state 3 to 4 kilos over your weight class limit, and you know that 4 weeks out you need to do a mini cut and then do some minor water manipulation to safely ensure that you make your weight class and that you can compete just as strong as you were normally in your weight class, that means you probably will need to push yourself to the point where you are hungry and you wouldn't be satisfied at every meal. And that's totally fine. And you probably also should weigh yourself to make sure that you actually meet that weight class cutoff. So for that 4-week period, you're stepping on the scale a few times per week, you're getting on MyFitnessPal, you're tracking, and then between competitions, you shift back towards your normal habits. I think there's nothing wrong with that. And I think it would probably be risky and probably more stressful to a powerlifter to try to not step on the scale and just hope they made their weight class. So that isn't advised. Another example would be if you were a fitness model or a physique competitor, and the level of leanness required for you to either show up at the shoot or get on stage and be successful is something that will result in extreme hunger and diminished signals of satiety. Well, obviously you can't listen to your satiety and hunger signals. But outside of that, you actually have a ton of options. You mentioned that I haven't been tracking macros for a while, and that's true. I haven't tracked macros since 2012, and I've competed in powerlifting, and I've just stayed in basically the weight class where I hover around. I have now this year done 2 different mini cuts, and I've actually gotten reasonably lean. And I've also gone through a post PhD data collection gaining phase where I went up from about 93 to 100 kilos over the course of about just under a year and a half. And I did all of those things without tracking. And I did it by focusing on how hungry or how full I felt, and using that as a barometer and an auto-regulation tool for how much total calories I ate, with some tracking going on. And what I mean by some tracking is I never actually busted out MyFitnessPal, but in my head I would have a running tally of how much protein I was eating. And then I would basically just rely on the habits I've developed since 2004 when I started lifting and adopting a bodybuilding lifestyle, and just tracking the few things that haven't stuck from that habit kind of based lifestyle change. Like, for example, I need to make sure that I have enough fruit in my diet, and we need to make sure that we cook enough meals at home to get enough vegetables. And then, just keeping a running tally of protein in my head and also getting enough fluids. So something like we cook at home 4 times per week and at a minimum for dinner. And then I also every day typically have a protein or Greek yogurt shake with 2 to 3 pieces of fruit. And that gets me my fluid intake, my fruits and my vegetables, and also contributes towards my protein intake for the day. So those things I do, and I just make sure they occur. But the portion sizes at the meals when I sit down, like you said, or when we go out to eat, or when I have lunch or whatever, are dictated by hunger and satiety. And if I'm going through a mini cut, I simply just make different decisions, and I stay a little more hungry all the time, or a little less full. And when I'm trying to gain weight, I make sure that I'm eating much more calorie dense foods. I'm including more non quote unquote bodybuilding lifestyle foods. We eat out more frequently. I don't make as much of an effort to get in fruits and vegetables, which fill me up. So I make these qualitative changes to my diet. And I pay attention to the level of satiety and hunger that I have to achieve my goals. Now, when I get on stage next year, because I'm going to be starting a diet in about a month, I'm definitely going to, either from the very start or at a certain point, start tracking macros and being more precise, because at a certain point, it doesn't serve you to pay attention to hunger and satiety. In fact, you probably shouldn't. You probably want to just get to a place of acceptance, like, I'm going to be hungry, but that's not my focus. I've got these numbers and they're going to restart tomorrow. And that's when I think you'll be served by something like If It Fits Your Macros. And you probably should do that, because, getting to the point of having, striated glutes is certainly not going to happen for 99% of people with just kind of going by feel. And it would probably be better to be a little more quantified.
Yeah, I think that's just brilliantly said. And I believe you put out a blog post maybe a year ago, I think around the episode with Mike Israetel that we did on the bulking debate, just to plug that episode, where you made a case for an autoregulated gaining phase and how eating based on hunger and satiety signals and just letting your calories go up and down and fluctuate across time because you're eating based on hunger and satiety signals can be better almost than putting yourself in a 300 calorie surplus and eating, say, 3,500 calories, regardless of whether you were sitting on your ass all day or you were running up and down and training hard, because your surplus over time will be more accurate given your needs. So do you want to touch on this a little, or I covered everything with the question?
Yeah, I think you actually covered that pretty well with your question. And but yeah, I wrote that article because I had looked back and I went, man, this bulking phase was pretty successful, and I haven't had an intentional quote unquote bulking phase since 2010, I think, at that point, because it had just not been successful. I had gaining phases, obviously, but intentionally trying to gain a substantial amount of weight, more than a pound a month on average at my stage of the game, and having it work well and not have tracked, I think flew in the face of my own preconceived notions of what is optimal. So definitely. I think you summed it up well, though, that we have greater levels of hunger when we burn more calories, and we have greater levels of satiety when we burn less, so that we're regulating our energy system. And that is the natural state to be in when you are paying attention to and eating for physiological reasons. So using those signals that your body gives you can be a good idea, and it will probably be more accurate than your guesses at whether you burn more or less calories in a given day. And it is a free built-in barometer that we all have as humans. So why not use it? Although that is easier said than done. The whole reason we have an obesity epidemic is, at least in part, because we have become very disassociated with physiological reasons for eating, and this is unrelated to fitness. You might have been told as a kid that you have to finish your plate before you can have dessert. You might have been told, as a kid, that you have to eat your entire, lunch or lunch bag when you go to work, or when you go to school. You might have been in the military like I was, and you have 5 seconds to eat your entire breakfast for the entire basic training period. And now all of a sudden you find yourself always eating quickly, and your hunger signals are always delayed a little bit, or your satiety signals, I should say. You might be someone who goes to a restaurant and feels like, I paid $30 for this meal. Of course I'm going to eat it all, versus, leaving whatever's left You might be someone who has to eat on the go, and you're driving and you can't even think about the fact that you're eating, and it's just a way to get it in because you know you're supposed to eat. All these things that we have in modern society encourage us to not pay attention to these signals. It's not just tracking macros like we do in the weird little fitness community we're a part of. So I think getting in touch again with those natural signals can be a very important lesson, and just an important life skill, really, that can actually serve an athlete, because there's data showing that the more active you are, the more finely tuned your hunger and satiety signals are. It's actually the sedentary people who have a disassociation between energy intake and satiation. There's a good amount of data to suggest that athletes and like laborers and people who have a very high energy expenditure have a more finely tuned satiety response to meals, and they also have appropriate energy intakes as well. So I think this is something that fits nicely with an athletic lifestyle.
Yeah, and we'll start wrapping up shortly, I promise. But you just keep bringing up such valuable points that I just need to reflect on them. I think when people bring up the obesity epidemic and the obesity statistics to make the point of why eating without macro tracking is just a recipe for failure, I think that these people just don't realize how far they have come by investing into a fundamentally healthy fitness type lifestyle and resistance training and eating a high protein diet and a nutrient dense diet, and just how big of a gap is there separating them from the people who unfortunately represent the obesity epidemic. And I think just logically, if you pause for a second, I mean, when someone is eating 6,000 calories a day of hyper palatable foods, I mean, is it really the lack of macro tracking that is the problem here, or maybe it's just a complete lack of control over their food environment and some serious psychological considerations. So that's one point. And the other point is, I want to reiterate what you just said, that perhaps even for a contest prep, which I think is going to blow many people's minds, perhaps it can be a viable strategy to sort of eat ad libitum and without tracking macros down to a point where you can still manage it. So maybe at the point where you're maybe 9-10% body fat or so. And that at that point, at which point your hunger signals might be a bit too strong for you to eat without tracking and still be in a negative energy balance, then transition over to tracking macros for the final phase of the contest prep.
You made a few good points there, man. So I think one thing I want to say is, it's very true that some people might be listening to this and going, well, the goals I have, like if I just listen to hunger and satiety, I wouldn't reach them. Now, unless you're a competitor or a fitness model, I would challenge you right now to potentially change those goals, because that's not sustainable for most people. I can't tell you how many times I've consulted with people who are trying to get lean again for the 40th time, sometimes trying different approaches, being more rigid and trying to live with a level of restraint that is inappropriate. And that's not healthy. Like, that's not a fitness lifestyle, to be in a state that's probably, relative energy deficiency. That's a syndrome, that's potentially harmful. Living with a level of metabolic adaptation, having irregular menstrual cycles, etc. So I think the way I often tell people, how sustainable was a cut was once you have a few weeks after the cut is over, if it's a non-competitive cut, that's why I say weeks, not months, and you brought your calories back up, and you're eating a little more normally. If you're still hungry, it's probably too lean. It's probably not sustainable. And that's how I gauge the success of like a recovery diet for competitors or a shortcut for non-competitors, etc. So I think that's the first thing, is a lot of people might need to accept the fact that the way they want to look is not necessarily that sustainable. However, like you just pointed out, and a good example of this is I did a local seminar here when Menno Henselmans was traveling. We spoke at Get Strength here in Auckland, and he shared how he used a ad libitum, which just means eating as much as you want, diet for maybe the first half of his contest prep, where he would just increase the volume of low calorie foods that were very filling. So he had a higher fruit and vegetable intake, higher fiber intake, higher protein intake, and he had all of these habits that he would lean on that would result in less total calorie consumption without actually tracking and without ever stopping himself and restraining himself. And when you look at the pictures, I would say he got exactly to where you were saying, somewhere between 9 to 11% for a male, and the equivalent for that for a female is probably in the high teens as far as body fat percentage. And I think that is very reasonable, and that may be sustainable for many too. But not all. I think some people are going to find that spot 5 or 6% body fat higher. Some might even be a little bit lower. Those blessed few. But I think there's nothing wrong with taking a more qualitative and quote unquote intuitive approach to a point where you start to notice, man, I'm kind of always hungry. I'm looking at my broccoli and I want to eat even more broccoli, but I'm actually uncomfortable. Once you start to get these weird, confusing signals and you become aware that you're kind of always food focused, at that point, you probably should shift away from that approach. But it's definitely doable, and I've seen people get pretty damn lean, perhaps not stage lean, but a good chunk of the way there without actually tracking.
Yeah, excellent. And, I'm really, really glad you say this, because I've been talking about these things on the podcast for a while, but it's very different for many people to hear it from me and hearing it from someone like you who has the experience as a competitor, as a coach, and also the scientific credibility as a researcher. And I just think that you helped more people with this than you would realize. So my final question to you, Eric, is, I put out a post not long ago about the things that have changed in my life ever since I stopped tracking macros, and some of the things I mentioned in this interview as well. But I'd be curious, if you reflect back on the times in which you were tracking macros and you compare it with the times and the several years in which you weren't, what would be some of the things and some of the big changes in your life that occurred during these periods?
I think the big one is just having less guilt and resentment. I think I was able to work around it. A lot of people wouldn't even know that I was tracking macros, and I had a lot of, I think, probably positive behaviors that are good lessons for when you do have to track. Like I would eat as much as I wanted in some of my earlier meals in the day, and then just write down the weight and what the foods were, probably with some awareness of how far I could or couldn't take it. And then the only meal that I would really plan out was my last meal. So that I would, eat whatever's left, kind of thing. So I'd kind of auto-regulate to a point, and then at the end of the day, I would close that line a little more accurately. But when I was referring to the guilt and resentment, if my wife wanted to go out to eat, or a friend called us up or wanted to hang out, or there was a holiday or something like that, I could most of the time make it work, and I would estimate and do that. But there were times, like if it had been a few days in a row, and then all of a sudden then a friend comes and calls me, and I'm going, man, like my weekly calories are going to be too high, or this is going to force me to just have mostly protein tomorrow or protein before bed or something like that. I would find myself feeling resentment. And like when a friend calls you out of the blue and wants to hang out and take you out for a meal, the last thing you want to feel is resentment. That's a good thing, right? Or like thinking I want to go see a movie or do a movie and dinner with my wife, but deciding not to do it because I feel like I haven't been in enough control on my diet. I think that made me realize that's not good. I should be able to just go out to eat at a meal with my wife because I want to have a date night with her, and then just eat a little bit less or order less, or just make a different decision without necessarily having to quantify it or feeling nervous if I couldn't. So I think that is really where it stood out in my life, was that even though I had adopted all these behaviors to where sometimes I'd look at weekly caloric intake, excuse me, or I would have high and low days, or I'd even borrow, like a lot of the strategies I've written about, like shifting from macros to protein to calories to just calories, or even, doing 20% borrowing, or allowing 15% of calories from alcohol. Like I had all these systems and I would use them, but they still required some thought, and they didn't come at a zero emotional cost, even if it was a lot lower than I was when back in the day when I was more rigid with my tracking. So being able just to let go of all of that, and just auto-regulate a bit more, and learn that skill, I think has been very positive for me, and has resulted in a much net better life. And it hasn't cost me, I don't think, anything in terms of my quote unquote gains. Before I left for New Zealand, my best bench was lower than it is now. My best squat was lower than it was at its peak. My physique's better now, and mini cuts are easier now, believe it or not, without tracking. And just in general, I have found that I can be more productive, and it's just one less thing I have to focus on. With all that said, when it does come time to track again, I have a feeling it'll be kind of like a bit of a bumpy road and having to relearn a skill. And so I think there's probably something to be said for when you do know that you will have to track. If you have a goal that doesn't align with paying attention to your satiety and hunger, you probably want to start a little early, a few weeks out, to kind of like relearn and reacquaint yourself. Like I probably am used to a version of MyFitnessPal that's multiple years old. So, I probably used it before Under Armour bought it. So it'll be good to kind of relearn that skill again.
Right. Awesome. And, listening to this, on the one hand, I needed to cringe. And on the other hand, it just made me feel warm and fuzzy on the inside, because I had the exact same experience about the guilt and the resentment and almost feeling angry when a friend reached out to grab some beer and a pizza. And I think these are the things that so many people experience, and yet so many of them will ever talk about it because it's not cool, it's not sexy to talk about this. And I think many feel embarrassed about these things, and probably many are also in denial when they are going through this in the moment. And I think hearing someone like you talk about this honestly will give a wake-up call to many people. And I just hope that we gave a nice pitch to the listeners to try this auto-regulated eating a go, because it's just such a useful skill to have in your arsenal. But like we touched on here, there are just major lifestyle and psychological benefits to mention here. So, Eric, this has been an absolute honor, and I could talk to you for hours about this, but I hope that one day we'll have the chance to chat about this in person finally. So my final question is, how much volume should we do? Just kidding.
No, I appreciate it, man. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And please just tell people where they can find out about your work, your resources, and anything that you would want them to check out.
For sure. So most relevant to this discussion is you probably want to go to muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. The second edition of my books, which actually go into this a lot more and interweave these concepts throughout all the levels, are coming out. This is the books I've co-written with Andrea Valdez and Andy Morgan, are going to be launching before Christmas. So check that out, probably mid to late December. And if you're a competitor and you're interested in finding anything about the sport, either physique or strength sport, check us out at 3dmusclejourney.com. That's the number 3, the letter D, then musclejourney.com. Those are the two places where you can find most of our content and bridges to other things. If you're a big time nerd and you want to learn more about the coming up science of every month in strength and physique sport, you want to check out strongerbyscience.com/mass. That's my research review with Mike Zerdos and Greg Knuckles. And we've got a cool sale for Cyber Monday and Black Friday where we're giving a large percentage of our profits away to charity. So now would be a good time to sign up for that. And then if you want more day-to-day kind of content, you can follow me at Helms 3DMJ on Instagram.
Wonderful. And it's Wednesday. Is tomorrow 3DMJ podcast coming out, or you're still on your podcast deload with the team?
Podcast is coming out very soon. We're about to start a new season.
Yay. Awesome. I've been missing you guys. Awesome. Dr. Helms, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure.
Abel, as always, privilege and a pleasure to come on. Thank you.
All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode and liked what you heard. And if you did, then I think you'd definitely love our SSD training and nutritional course that we recently put out with Børge Fagerli. This program not only contains a 12-week phasic training program that you can use to time efficiently and safely build the best body you can, but also gives you 4+ hours of video lectures about managing your nutrition and lifestyle to not only look good, but feel and perform optimally. And besides this, you will also be getting some really awesome bonuses like Børge Fagerli's MyoReps and Zero Carb ebook. So if this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and check out sustainableselfdevelopment.com. And of course, to not miss out on future episodes like this, subscribe to the podcast and you'll be up to date on everything we'll be putting out. So thank you for hanging around up until now, and see you next time.